reasons that it's thought to be one of the first letters in the New Testament. Dwayne and I are going to kind of try to take the New Testament in chronological order over the next year or so, to where there's a lot of debate over what order it was actually written in, but most of them are fairly similar. They might swap Galatians and James. I don't know which one's older. It just depends on who you Google and what list you looked at. But those are two that are thought to be the earliest of the writings, for a number of reasons. Partly because, and scholars study this, the style of language and the wording that is used, and the fact that, internal evidence. James was part of that Jerusalem council in Acts 15, but he doesn't mention any of that in this letter. So they thought that this is probably written before that council met. The language contains a lot of Old Testament type of wording, and scholars believe that that's one of the reasons that they believe that it was early. I don't know all of that. I haven't studied languages and stuff to see patterns like that. I look for other things when I'm studying, more for instruction, not necessarily be forming opinions about when it was written or who it was written by. And who it was written by is one of those. Oh, we're not there yet. That's the next slide. Get mad at my order. This is some of the things that it has been called. The letter from James has been called the Proverbs of the New Testament. It seems to deal with a lot of different things, and they don't always seem to be coherent in the way that they are presented. But I think the more that you read it, you'll start to see a flow. Whether maybe I just started looking for that, and then I was looking for that, so that's what I found. But I really tried to see if I could find some kind of a pattern in James of a flow from beginning to end. It's called the Gospel of Common Sense. Well, we have a real lack of that in the world today, so maybe that's a good thing that somebody wrote an epistle that was just common sense.
It's referred to in that same context of being a how-to book.
I'm sorry?
I said it's referred to in that same context of being common sense as being a how-to book.
A how-to book, yeah.
Yeah, a book of Christians, being a Christian for dummies or something like that, in modern terms.
Yeah, and that's kind of what Proverbs is. When you look at Proverbs, you see those kind of little couplets that's written in poetry most of the time, but this one really isn't. But you see those little couplets of, this is what the wise man does, but this is what the foolish man does. It also, and I'm sure that Martin Luther had no idea that this would endure this long. It was called the Epistle of Straw. That's an infamous statement, I guess you would call it. Martin Luther was one of the celebrated catalysts of the Protestant Reformation. And his actual quote was, "Therefore, St. James's epistle is really an epistle of straw compared to these others, for it has nothing of the nature of the gospel about it." I'm sure he probably regretted that, saying that at some point, maybe not, but we're gonna show where that is just like a lot of politicians. You just said one dumb thing and it stuck with you for 500 years. I mean, we still remember what he said, and long past This is the next question that I usually ask when I'm doing an introduction of a book. Who wrote the book? It doesn't really identify himself. It just says James. There are 5 James mentioned in the New Testament. Probably, or I won't say probably, but it's a good possibility that 2 of those are the same James. I think what do I have down there? Number 2 and number 3. The first is the father of the apostle Judas, not Judas Iscariot, but in Luke 16, it's talks about Judas, whose father was James. The next one is, and these 2 I want you to look up too with me. James the Less, they call him, or James the Younger, depending on your translation. Look at Luke 6:16. Luke chapter 6, verse 16. It begins in 4 apostles that Jesus chose. Whom he named apostles. These were the disciples he chose from them, 12 whom he named disciples. And in 16 it says Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. So there were 2 apostles named Judas. One was Iscariot. The other one was the son of a man named James. Now, if you look at Mark 15:40, go to Mark 15:40. And this is Jesus at his crucifixion. And this is right after the centurion said, truly this man was the Son of God. There were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. Okay, now look at Mark 6:3. Same book, just go back a little bit to Mark 6:3. Is this not the carpenter's son, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? Those were his brothers. And are not his sisters here with us? So the son of Mary shows up in both of those verses. And so this could be the same James. We know that he had a brother named James. And it looks like these 2 might be related. They could be a different Mary that he's talking about, because there was a lot of Marys. But they're at the cross. We know that Mary, his mother, was there, and Mary Magdalene. And so I believe those 2 are related. So there's probably only 1, 2, 3, 4. There's probably only 4 Jameses in the New Testament, because these 2 I believe these 2 are the same.
And that's what the author of my Bible commentaries, he suspected there was 4, or they did, it was a joint writing, but
Yeah.
they suspected there's just 4.
Then there's the James that is the son of Alphaeus. He's one of the apostles, one of the first known ones. And then James the apostle, the son of Zebedee, who was brother with John. He was part of the inner circle, Peter, James, and John. So we have those. We don't know with any certainty which one it was, but tradition and what should I say? General acceptance by most scholars is that it was James, the son of Jesus, or the brother of Jesus. One thing for sure, when he wrote this epistle, and the people that he wrote it to, they knew exactly who it was. I mean, you get a letter in the mail today from Joey, and you know who the letter's from. You know who's writing this letter. But 2,000 years from now, there might have been 10 Joeys in this congregation at a time. And so not everybody would know which one it was. We all know which one it would be, but
Do you wonder if they think it's James, the half brother of Jesus? He became a leader in the Jerusalem church. He was an elder in the Jerusalem church,
yes,
and so very prominent within the church during that time period. So I guess it would, in reasoning, you would say, well, because of his position and so on and so forth, it puts him in a place that he might likely be the author of the book because of that.
yeah. And that makes sense. All that makes perfect sense, because he would be the one that would be sending out instructions to other Christians. James was a leader in the Jerusalem church. Paul calls him an apostle in Galatians 1:19, and in Galatians 2:9, he calls him one of the pillars of the church. And in Ephesians, we see that the gospel is built on the foundation of Jesus. The pillars are the apostles. And so that's why Paul probably refers to him as a pillar.
Also, I read that it was mentioned that, he never brings up Jesus in his book as far as relationship or anything like that. But, and they say, that's one of the things, some people question that, but the other side of that coin, I can see that he's not hanging on his relationship. If it were him, he's not putting any credit with his blood relationship with Jesus Christ. That's, he recognizes him as God's son and not his brother. And so therefore, he does not hang anything on that relationship that somebody would think he was more important than somebody else because of that relationship.
That's a really good point too. When we have a tendency to drop names to try to influence people a lot of times, and we don't see that. And that's part of the reason that, like you said, Martin Luther said what he did, because he doesn't talk about Jesus in the book. But as we'll see later on, he doesn't exactly quote Jesus, but everything that he tells us is exactly what Jesus said. And we'll see that comparison is really incredible, especially in the first chapter. He's the one that spoke at the Jerusalem Council. He's the one that seems to have come up with the writing, the letter that they were going to distribute out to the Gentile Christians. Paul conferred with him and the elders in Jerusalem all the way in Acts 21 when they came. Now, I think more than a couple of us have thought that he got bad advice from him at that time because what it stirred up, but God knew all of that was happening, and that's how Paul ended up in Rome, because of those kind of things. So that always amazes me. One of the many things that amaze me about God is how he can make his plan work from bad situations. When you look at David and Bathsheba and Solomon, I mean, the first baby died, and it was just a horrible, adulterous, murderous scenario that David had caused there. And yet Solomon came out of that, the wisest and richest man in the world, and that wrote maybe more Proverbs than anybody else ever wrote, and did more to further our education of the world than anybody else in history. So God can make good things happen from bad situations. Always remember that. That's something that's always needed. And you get in a pit and you get in a rut or something like that, just remember, God's working his plan, and we should be the most confident people in the world, knowing that God can get us out of that. Wealthy people a lot of times rely on their money to get them out of situations. Smart people rely on their brains to get them out of situations. Those things are all finite. We rely on a God that is infinite. And so if we rely on that to get us out, him to get us out of our situations, that is so much more common sense than relying on something that is finite. Because you can get in situations that money can't get you out of. And you can get in situations that your brain can't get you out of. And we experienced that just over the Thanksgiving holiday with the situations we got ourselves into trying to make it to Kentucky. I'm glad God knows diesel mechanics, because where I broke down and what happened and everything else, I had a finite source of money, and I had an absolute finite knowledge of diesel engines. I didn't know what to do, and everything worked out well. And we made it safe. We made it back safe. And we prayed all the way up and all the way back. It was that, because God was the only one that was going to get us through that. I just knew it. Okay. The book was written, when you read that first chapter, or the first verses, the book was written to whom? Who was the book written to? Yeah, the 12 tribes in the dispersion. What could that possibly mean? I mean, we know that the 12 tribes got scattered hundreds of years before this was written. So who's he writing to?
Possibly the Christians that are dispersed.
The Christians driven out away from Jerusalem local.
Okay,
Christian Jews.
Christian Jews. Yeah, literally Christian Jews outside of Jerusalem. Or if you did it figuratively, as we talked about last week, when Paul referred to the Israel of God, those are the Christians, Jew and Gentile, that are outside of Jerusalem, that are out there, what we now refer to as the church. So either one of those could be, because of the language and the Jewish references and some of the prejudices even that we see in this, talking about rich and old and how the congregation was laid out. Many may suggest that the main audience was Christian Jews.
Well, if you consider that it was written, one thought is it was written in AD 44, which was very early, only 12 years after Pentecost or something like that.
Yeah,
So it would be very obvious that the Jewish Christians were the of Christianity at this particular time the book was written. The effect on the Gentiles had started, but it hasn't gotten where it will be with all the missionary journeys and everything that's going on later on, whenever the Gentile Christian church grew in leaps and bounds. And the Gentile and the Jewish church was still stagnant, I guess you would say, or slow growing because of all the Jewish infighting that we talked about in the last number of weeks about Pharisees and Sadducees and their arguments and all that, and the Judaizing teachers and all the stuff that plagued the Jewish Christians.
yeah, and why would he call it a dispersion?
Because many fled for their lives.
When Paul's was, this makes it probably after Paul had done his little thing with Stephen, right after Stephen, Paul started ravaging the church and the church was scattered and they went everywhere. That's a good possibility that he was talking about, that kind of dispersion. The Christians went just everywhere. I mean, like Aquila and Priscilla went clear to Rome. From what we understand of Corinthians, they went clear to Rome before they got run out of Rome and came back to Corinth. So yeah, this was a dispersion of Christians that had gone out.
Ron,
Yes.
if you look back at history and you think about the Roman Empire, and you remember us talking about, God's time is different than our time, but he chose the time in history where there was an ability, roads had been built, shipping was prevalent. He chose a time when they would be able to escape.
Yeah, that's so interesting to look back at that and see the different, the Greeks took over before that and they universalized the language. And then the Romans took over and they built the interstates. And, there's a pattern to all of that just can't be haphazard. It's not just circumstance or whatever. It was all planned. Yes.
One more point on the 12 tribes. The general population of the world at that time in that area was that the 12 tribes were God's people. That had been true for thousands of years. So maybe the 12 tribes here are still God's people.
God, yes. And that's a good reference or a good analogy too, because everybody knew that there was other places it's been written that Moses was taught in every synagogue in every city around the then known world. We know that the 12 tribes got dispersed a long time ago, but they have always been the 12 tribes, even today, the world over, 12 tribes, even though Ishmael supposedly had 12 tribes. 12 tribes are considered Israelites, Jews, and that type of, that's just a metonymy that got stuck with them. I agree, that's a good point. Oops, I went too far. Yes, sir.
So is it proper to consider the 12 tribes of Israel God's people, or whether they're saved or not, or were we just talk about the ones who were saved in the 12 tribes? Because a lot of them, as the Bible says, they were stiff-necked and, didn't want to learn God's way, so they kind of done it the way they wanted to.
Yeah.
We know that doesn't work more often than not. So
Well, and we've seen from Paul's letters that even in the church, now, we don't have any of that here, but there were some stiff-necked people in the church. And there probably continues to be some stiff-necked people. We don't have that problem here, but, I mean, maybe myself, I'm kind of stiff-necked on a lot of things. But yeah, that's a good reference too, because you can get stuck in tradition. You can get stuck in
I
tradition.
think there's also an element of it, and I seem like, to me, it gleams at, is that God transitioned from a physical Israel to a spiritual Israel.
Mhm.
And so, in doing, Israel was the 12 tribes when they were physical. And in reference to the spiritual Israel, this could be some kind of a connection back to that, and that this is the church at that time. This is Christians at that time. Even though they're dispersed, even though they're spread about, but they're making up that spiritual asset. And like you referred to earlier, the 12 tribes have always been associated with God's people. And so therefore, maybe it's still being used in that terminology, because when he wrote it, people understood what he was talking about.
Yeah.
I don't think they would look, because 10 of the tribes had been gone for centuries now, you know. There was only a couple of true tribes that were left at this point in history. This was before the destruction. There were still archives and things like that where they could trace their lineage, but they were really only a couple of tribes left. The rest of them had been broken up,
Had been broken.
gone into apostasy and all that kind of stuff, So there wasn't truly 12 tribes that existed even in this point in history.
Yeah.
So I have a tendency to believe it it's referencing and grouping the Christian world together and defining them as such, as being God's people again, just like the 12 tribes did in Moses' time.
Yes, Bill?
I don't understand the term known world. Preach to every creature under heaven. That wouldn't be unknown world.
I don't know whether that's just assumed that it was the known world versus the places that had yet to been explored by civilized men. You start running into all kinds of racist language when you start talking about things like that. But yeah, that's all a good discussion too, when he uses the word world or earth or land. What are they referring to? Are they referring to just that area? Are they referring to the known area, or is that actually the whole globe? And that's a discussion for that's been going on for centuries of what is meant by some of that. But let me ask you this question. There's a couple of books in the Bible that are just written to one person. Philemon, and John wrote to Gaius, and he wrote to, I think, Mary. Was that the other one?
Luke wrote to Theophilus.
And Luke wrote to Theophilus. Good. I forgot that one. Yeah, Acts and Luke. Let me ask you this. If those instructions were the truth, the inspired, Holy Spirit inspired word of truth for one Christian, who do they apply to?
Everyone.
All Christians. If it was the truth for one Christian, it's the truth for all Christians. So it really doesn't matter so much if we narrow this down to exactly who he was writing to. Once we understand that he's writing to Christians, then that becomes applicable to us. Does it not? These other things are just all interesting to try to put things in historical context. But really, you know, the whole New Testament, we're reading other people's mail. Most of the time, other people's mail doesn't apply to you. But in this case, if it applies to any of us, it applies to all of us. Now, what did James write about? And we'll get into some of the different themes that he wrote about here in a little bit. But look at, if you will, look with me. We're going to do a lot of flipping back and forth here if we've got the time. Because one of the complaints Martin Luther had about James's letter is that it didn't compare to the other gospels, that it lacked Jesus's teaching. Look at the second verse, James 1:2. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that your testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Now look at Matthew 5:10. We're going to look, just flip back and keep your thumb in the Beatitudes in chapter 5, 6, and 7. Actually, 5 and 7. Look at Matthew 5:10. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Kind of sounds like trials and tribulations that count it all joy when you fall into those, because blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Now look at James 1:4. Let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Matthew 5:48. Therefore you must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. James 1:5. This is just in the first few verses of James. James 1:5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. Now look at Matthew 7 through 12. Chapter 7 through 12. And I say, ask, and it will be given to you. Knock, and it will be open for you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, it will be open. And the list goes on. I mean, I found all kinds of comparisons to, just in this first chapter, to the Beatitudes. Now that's kind of the constitution of Christianity right there. And so James is just repeating that in different words at a little bit different time. But to say that he didn't use any of Jesus' teaching is just not reading it well. I've got those in case anybody wanted to write them down. I put them down there for you. But I've got a longer list than that. Whoops, I'm going the wrong direction. Okay, here's kind of various themes that James talked about. And all of this is the same kind of teaching that Jesus did. If you look at these words that he uses, he talks about faith. He talks about faith a lot, but putting your faith into actions, that's another thing that Martin Luther had trouble with, because he thought it contradicted Paul in Romans. But it doesn't really contradict him. Works is a fair translation of the Greek word ergon, but the word has kind of been twisted today. When we think of work, we think of getting paid. And so it's more of, and I know there's a different, and you can't force it to fit because it is what it is. There's a different word that we have today, and that's action. You don't necessarily get paid for your actions. Your actions are a result of things that you think or things that you believe need to be done. So we get away from the word works a little bit because work always implies earning something. Yes.
In my own experience, I've never found anything in the gospel that wasn't as practical as it was spiritual.
You're right. It's all practical. It's all, and that's one of the reasons I think this is called the Book of Common Sense, because he puts it right out there pretty easy where the cabs can get right down to it.
Ron, he starts off identifying himself as a bondservant, which is also reminding them that they're bondservants also to Jesus. And when you think about a bondservant, they have had something given to them, sometimes maybe a place to live, and in return, they, because they're grateful for that home or that place, they are going to work because that's what they need and should do. We work to show our appreciation to God. Something, he already paid the price.
Yes. And we have a difficult time in this generation or this age with the word bondservant because it always reminds us of slavery. And that doesn't have any sense of gratitude or appreciation that goes along with it. So, but it is a good word. And we should have that kind of a mentality of a bondservant mentality. Or I heard somebody say one time, y'all smell like sheep. You know, because sheep follow. And so that was kind of, but words get twisted over time. Perfection is another theme that James talks about, and perfection is where we've twisted into, instead of meaning complete, whole, we think of it without flaw or without error. You have to be perfect, like God is perfect, or you can't be saved. And that's not what perfection means in the Bible. Perfection is, that's what we're always striving for, is to be complete, mature, whole, not without blemish and not without flaw. We all know that we got things that we can't help. You know, I can't help being as good looking as I am. And just, there's no change in that. I've been working on it, but no. Some of the other things that he talks about, seriously, patience. He talks about patience in the beginning of the book. He talks about patience at the end of the book. Wisdom. He talks about wisdom throughout the book. Not only, a lot of this stuff is discussed right up in the first chapter. He covers everything and then kind of elaborates on it as he goes along. They are at the heart of the gospel, something every Christian should be trying to mature into. He talks about truth. He talks about the rich and the poor. He talks about prayer. All of the themes that he talks about surrounded around the things that Christ taught us. So for Martin Luther to say that it just doesn't compare to any of the other gospels, it just lacks something. It should have been done and said better than that, and I'm sure he regretted that. Our aim in this study is going to be to help people to mature into Christ. The mature Christian is patient in trials and temptations. The mature Christian is a doer of the word and not a hearer only. Really good practical advice. The mature Christian is impartial. He talks about partiality. He completes his faith. He makes his faith perfect, if we use that word. Makes his faith perfect by his actions. He doesn't become perfect by working. Or perfect by works. I've changed that wording around. Instead of works, I'm using the word action. It is a different Greek word, but it has more of the sense. Our actions come out of our faith. Our actions don't cause us to have, well, sometimes they do cause you to have more faith. But our actions come out of our faith because of the things that Jesus has taught us, because of the things that he has done for us. Our actions should reflect that, and they won't become hypocritical. The mature Christian controls his tongue. Another thing James talks about. Pursues wisdom from above, spiritual wisdom. Rises above strife and worldliness with humility, and is not hypocritical. Yields his plans to God's will. Jesus said that in the garden. Is patient and prayerful in all situations, good and bad. Converts erring Christians, and is not overwhelmed by the challenges of this letter. And remember that we're to be doers and not just hearers. Thank you.